Hello and welcome to this first lesson in a series of lessons that is going to analyse spoken mode texts for AQA language and literature, looking particularly at remembered places and Paris anthology. And this first lesson we're going to look at mode, at what mode means, at the distinction between written and spoken modes, explain why it's important to you, and explain how we can look a little bit further into mode and use it to help us when we do our AQA Remembered Places question. The Remembered Places question is a comparison question, and it takes two texts from the anthology on Paris and asks you to compare and contrast how language is used in these texts. The examiners always choose, or the exam board always choose for this question, two texts with contrasting modes. Two texts where there's perhaps a real difference in the quality of language used, obviously to enable you to show your broad understanding of the different ways in which language is used. And this is the grading criteria for that question, and you can see that AO1, the first, is asking you to use the correct, accurate terminology and have good analytical methods. That's a familiar assessment objective for all of your questions. AO3, there's 15 marks available for AO3, which is to show your understanding of the significance and influence of contexts in which texts are produced and received. And I suppose we can sometimes think of context in terms of the context of the subject, the political context of Paris, the social context of Paris, but we also really need to think of context in terms of the context of production and reception as specified in that question, which means thinking of the linguistic context, if you like, the context of written and spoken mode actually forms an aspect of that context. Whether it's a conversational context or in the context of an advert or promoting something. These are the key contexts that we really need to explore, the linguistic contexts. And then finally, there are marks there for exploring comparison, exploring connections, comparing, and with two different modes, you will be able to give an analysis of the different ways, a comparative analysis of the different ways in which communication takes place. So we'll begin by saying that there are two, fundamental modes in linguistic communication, and that is the written mode and the spoken mode. As GCSE students, you were well accustomed to analysing written texts, literary texts and written texts for the language side of the course as well. You also looked at play scripts and dialogue, and these are written representations of spoken mode, but there hasn't for a few years been any GCSE unit of study which has asked you to analyse natural speech, and so it's an unfamiliar thing to do. And we should probably start off by saying that natural speech is the primary linguistic mode. You've been studying speech, you've been speaking and listening long before you were ever reading and writing, and so there's something quite fundamental about this mode of communication. And perhaps we overlook, it's overlooked a little bit in that you can get all the way to 16 without studying the way that we actually speak and listen. There is, of course, more to modes of communication than just the spoken and written modes, and we often find that texts combine spoken and written modes of linguistic communication. If you look at that little model, is one way of modelling different forms of communication. There are extra linguistic ways of communicating meaning there are visual aspects to communication, there are oral, i.e. sound effects aspects to communication, or gestural in the gestures. If you look at the advert clip that's playing, that's looping there, you can see that that communicates in a number of different ways. There's obviously a linguistic method of communication there with the imperative, but there are visual aspects in terms of the logo and the movement. There are gestural aspects, and we can assume, although I don't have sound for this clip, we can assume that there would have been some kind of sound effect as well. So communication takes place across a whole load of modes, and it isn't as simple as to say that it's either one linguistic mode or another. Lots of texts combine written modes of communication and spoken modes of communication. The text that you are currently watching, this clip, this video itself, is an example of a multimodal text in that you can hear my spoken communication, but you've also got visually written text, and you've also got images combining with it. So this itself is a multimodal text, and we have to remember that it's not a question of text being one or the other. It's a question of how texts use combinations sometimes of different modes. And you can see in these two examples of linguistic communication that it isn't a simple case of a text being either spoken or written. In some cases, I suppose, a text is clearly a written mode text or is clearly a spoken mode text. But as we'll see in Paris, the distinction is sometimes blurred. Linguistic communication is highly adaptable and varied, and I suppose that we study on this course really the variety of linguistic communication. The two examples there, if you have a look at the, what we could call the group chat example of linguistic communication, and if we asked ourselves if that little interaction there we see from the cream team is a written text or a spoken text, well, obviously it is written or typed. So it belongs to a written text in that sense, in that it isn't actually spoken and the people themselves aren't speaking, but there are certainly undeniably aspects of spoken mode in this communication. The interactivity, the turn-taking. Actually, if you read it, it reads almost as a spoken communication. It would be very different if these two were writing letters to each other. That we'd expect the language to be very different. Similarly, there's an example from sign language, from what I think is American Sign Language, which is as grammatically complex as spoken and written forms of language, and exists probably somewhere in between. Well, it's neither really, but it has features of both, and it certainly shows us that it's not a simple distinction of all linguistic communication being either spoken or written. There's a great deal of variance and adaptation, which I think is, well, I believe is one thing that makes language so exciting. Spoken mode texts in Paris are, I guess one of the main distinctions is those that are transcribed and those that are not transcribed. And you'll notice that there's a number of spoken mode texts in Paris that have been transcribed rather than written out using the written mode. If you look at this extract, you will see, this is from text 11, this is from the Visiting Paris extract. You realise that the appearance of spoken language in transcript is very different from other written forms of communication, but it's also, superficially, it represents a drama play script in that we've got the speakers identified on the left there in the margin, but it's also fundamentally different in the way that language is represented compared to a play script. So at this point you should pause the video, you should look at the extract in front of you, and you should ask yourself, how is this spoken transcript different from not only written modes of communication, but drama play scripts? You may have identified the way that there are differences in the layout of the text. There are no capital letters or punctuation Spoken language is not punctuated, and punctuation we might call a written way, or we might think of punctuation as a written way of approximating aspects of spoken language. Commas we sometimes think of as pauses. Now obviously commas have their own grammatical rules for being applied, but I suppose there are ways in which punctuation helps us to imagine spoken aspects of a text. There are no capitals, there are no punctuation in the spoken transcripts. Instead we have pauses specified, what we can call a micropause, which is a full stop in brackets, stresses and overlapping speech, elongation, representations, ways in a transcript of representing, I guess, features of spoken language that can only be heard. So paralinguistic or extralinguistic features such as stressing a particular word, or elongating for emphasis, or other contextual information such as gesture. There are ways of representing those in transcripted speech. A playwright, of course, would be able to use stage directions to perhaps communicate some of this information. A good example would be a question mark. There are no question marks used in the spoken language transcripts, even though there are questions asked. The rules of written grammar do not apply to spoken transcripts. Now we can obviously sense when a question is used in a spoken transcript, because we can read the language and we can infer the question from that. But there might be aspects of representing a question, such as rising intonation, that aren't necessarily represented in a transcript. A transcript is a very imperfect way of capturing spoken language. Usually when we ask a question, the tone of our voice rises slightly at the end. Do you know what I mean? And that's an extra-linguistic or a paralinguistic way of representing meaning. And those ways aren't always captured accurately in a transcription, or you can't capture all of them. But there are attempts here to capture aspects of extra-linguistic communication, such as the bold stresses or the indication of elongated syllables. Your task that you should perform for your own curiosity is to record 15 to 30 seconds of either your own solo speech or discussion with someone on a given topic, and then to use the key there to transcribe it. And you'll actually find that during that you make decisions about how to represent the features of your spoken language, and the way that you actually transcribe it will affect the way that perhaps another person who hadn't heard the conversation or the speech would actually get meaning from the transcript. So a transcript is a representation of spoken language, and one that you'll be familiar with as you study Paris. Okay, a task for you now is to look at this range of, I think we have 9 texts which are transcribed in remembered places. The task for you now as you pause this video is to categorize those texts into similar groups. I think they can be meaningfully categorized into 3 groups. There are, of course, other ways of categorizing them, and you may find another method of doing. You won't have to read the full text in order to do this task. You'll only need to read the opening paragraph, or to get a sense overall of the text. In order to help you put these 9 into different categories, I'd like you to think about aspects such as multimodality, which we discussed earlier. I'd like you to think about ideas about spontaneity and planning, particularly to what extent are these texts pre-planned, and to what extent would they be spontaneous. And you can also think about ideas such as producers and receivers, and whether these are texts that are conversational, if you like, or whether these are texts that are one producer addressing a receiver. Okay, good luck. There is more, as you will have realised, to spoken mode than just a simple distinction from written mode. As you attempted to categorize those texts, you actually had to think of different questions about the way they were produced, the way they were received, their purpose, aspects such as whether they were intended to be recorded or whether they were ephemeral. Here is a really fantastic framework for exploring dimensions of mode. This is from a linguist called Hudson, and it's titled Dimensions of Mode. Hudson looks here at 6 different concepts in analysing any text, not just spoken text but written text as well, and he places these concepts on a continuum. For example, the transitoriness of a given text, meaning how far is this text meant to last. A published book is something that's intended to be permanent, something that's supposed to last a very, very long time. Whereas there are texts, of course, including examples of spoken language, which are very ephemeral. A note for the milkman or a conversation, these are things that are not intended to last. It's interesting to think of how a spoken mode text might vary on its transitory scale. A political speech would of course be something that we would expect to have a great deal of permanence, whereas conversational language is very ephemeral. Formality is something that should be familiar to you, and you should understand that formality is a continuum. There are of course more or less formal situations, highly informal situations, but I guess conversation between friends is an example of what we might call an informal text, but depending on who your friends are, your conversations will be more or less informal. Friends that you know very well and are very close with, your speech might be highly informal, whereas friends that you're perhaps closer to acquaintances, your speech may be slightly more formal but still informal. So this is a continuum. Features of standard English, which I suppose we can say is related to formality and the extent to which we use standard English. Spoken language, of course, tends to be much more irregular than written language, and so we see a lot of spoken texts slip closely towards the non-standard use. However, you will have perhaps just considered the Pathé newsreel text, an example of a spoken text that is highly formal and observes all of the rules of standard spoken English. The level of interactivity between the producer and the receiver, this was one of the aspects of the group chat that we looked at when we considered how mode can be more complex than just written and spoken mode. That's an example of a written text with a really high level of interactivity, in that producers and receivers are actually, I suppose all participants are both producing and receiving language in a kind of a conversation. So that was a high interaction text. Other texts, of course, are much lower interaction. You can't have a conversation with a telephone directory. Whether a text is message or socially orientated, I suppose in other contexts we look at this as purpose of a text. Is it, and of course it's related to the interactivity between the producer and the receiver. Does it have a social orientation or a message orientation? And finally, their dependence on context. A lot of literary texts that we look at, for example novels, they provide their own context. When a character in a novel says here or there, the novelist should have given you a setting so that you can already understand the context in which that utterance takes place. So literary texts provide their own context, and therefore they're quite independent of context. Conversations, the context tends to exist outside the text, is not provided within the text, and so they're highly dependent. For example, interpreting what someone says to you when you ask them directions for somewhere, that's highly dependent on where you are when you're asking, and where you are when you're asking won't explicitly feature in the conversation. It'll be something that both producer and receiver can reasonably assume and don't need to establish in the text itself. So this will become relevant when we look at Dexis later in this unit. The framework provided there gives you an excellent way to analyse the mode of any two texts. And as we are looking at the context of language, and as we are looking at the way that we compare different kinds of language, this evaluative framework is indispensable for you as you work through the whole of Paris, not just the written texts. Okay, at this point you might want to stop and look back at the texts that you were asked to examine from Paris, and think now about how these 6 concepts might help you further categorise or evaluate the categories into which you put the spoken text from the Paris anthology. And here's my approximation of exactly that task. Although I think I may have missed one off, which is the Lonely Planet Guide has been missed off there. But here we are. In the yellow group, we have Stories Awaiting in Paris, which is an advert for Eurostar, good example of a multimodal text. The Paris Riots, 1968, that's also a mixed modal or multimodal text. And the Walking Tour of the Louvre. These are all scripted and not spontaneous texts, to a greater or lesser degree. The Eurostar advert and the British Pathé reel would have been very tightly scripted, whereas there is something improvised or spontaneous about the Walking Tour of the Louvre, but we can reasonably assume that that was a scripted text. These were made to be recorded, so in terms of their transitoriness, these are permanent texts and not ephemeral. They vary in their formality and use of standard English. The Paris Riots being, of course, an example of a highly standard spoken text, but they're all message orientated and they all have low interaction between producer and receiver. However, I think there's a conversational aspect to the Walking Tour of the Louvre in which there is, of course, production and reception represented. So it's interesting in that text, I suppose, has audiences on 2 levels. I suppose there's the person that Rick Steves is talking to within the text, and there's his secondary audience, which is the audience who would be listening to his show. The texts in green are all examples of unscripted monologues, but possibly planned to a certain degree. So they're partly spontaneous. If you cast your mind back to your glory days of GCSE speaking and listening, you'll remember that you stood up and gave a speech on a given topic, and partly you had planned what you were going to say, but it wasn't tightly scripted. You were encouraged not to just read from a script. So you struck a balance somewhere between a fully spontaneous and a pre-planned text. And I think these are similar examples. Although these have been recorded, they're examples of personal discourse and they wouldn't normally be permanent. They aren't formal political speeches. They're examples, I guess, of personal discourse, one person communicating on a topic. They're all informal to a degree and non-standard, although they aren't highly informal. They don't use taboo and slang. They have a kind of a personal level of informality. They're non-standard, as a lot of spoken spontaneous interaction is, but there's a certain amount of interactivity because these are obviously being addressed to a particular receiver. So there might be examples of interactivity where these texts will address the person that they're spoken to, for example. These texts combine a sort of a message and a social orientation. They might be used to build relationships between people, such as the Memories of Places in Paris with Isabella and Sophia. I guess 2 people taking it in turns to discuss and compare their memories of places in Paris has got some kind of social function, but it's also down to giving a message. The bottom 2 in pink there were unscripted conversations, and they were highly spontaneous. And this conversational speech is ephemeral, it's non-standard, and it's informal. These texts are also, they're highly interactive and they're socially orientated. These are examples of natural spontaneous conversation, something that we haven't really looked at and something that you need a different approach to analysing when you compare to a written mode text. Okay. A couple of final remarks. Firstly, one on register. And I suppose this is linked to the aspect of formality in standard English in Hudson's dimensions of mode. Register, like the other aspects of mode, is the way that we choose a particular kind of speech given different contexts. And again, we're talking about context in terms of the context of an utterance, the context of a producer and a receiver, as we discussed when we looked at AO3. In the way that this question is analysed. A good example of that is the fact that in the old days we used to call people up and not know who we were talking to, and so people had a telephone register. This sort of strange neutral register. You don't know whether you're going to be talking to your boss, to your gran, or to your best friend when you picked up the phone back in the old days, and so you adapted this sort of neutral register. And it used to, commonly people would say, oh, you sound different on the phone. And the reason people sounded different was because they hadn't yet chosen the right register to communicate. So I need you to reflect, or it's wise for you to reflect within your own idiolect, within your own personal way of speaking, how do you adapt your own register to different situations? How do you change your register when you're speaking to a teacher compared to the way that you speak to your best friends? Do you, if you have a job, do you have a particular kind of workplace register? Do you have a register that you use within family situations or with particular members of your family? It's an interesting reflection to think about the way that we select a particular register, a particular style of speech in different contexts. Partly that register is about formality and informality, but it might also have distinct effects. As a teacher, there's a particular teacher's register, which I'm using at the moment, which I suppose values aspects such as clarity, which is rich in complex vocabulary, which explains itself, tries to take little for granted in terms of understanding. And that's a distinctive register. This isn't the way I speak to my family at home, you'd be surprised to hear. And then finally, thinking of functions of spoken language, which is, I guess, another way of thinking in more depth about what Hudson called orientation of language, is thinking about the way that we can contextualize spoken discourse according to its purpose. Again, this is looking at the context of any given interaction and moving you away from thinking of context in terms of political, social, geographical context. Knowing facts about Paris might be partly relevant to interpreting meaning in the text, but what's more relevant is, why is the person speaking? Are they speaking to give information? Do they have a referential function to their language? Are they conveying feelings? Is there an expressive function? Is there something transactional about communication in terms of people coming together to want to get things done? And we'll look at this in much greater detail in the next section on pragmatics. Or is there something interactional, establishing, maintaining relationships? We looked at social orientation in the Hudson continuum of orientation between message-oriented and socially orientated texts. And I guess this is a way of giving more colour to that kind of assessment of purpose. Also, there are phatic, what we call phatic functions of language, which is what we might call small talk, where they are essentially empty of meaning, but we just talk for a purely communicative, a purely relationship building or politeness, communicating politeness without any given meaning. That kind of communication is known as phatic talk. Okay, that's the end of this analysis of the way that mode can be considered in written and spoken, but particularly within spoken texts. So the final reflective question to ask you is, what have you learned about the ways spoken discourse can be contextualized accurately? And you might make use in your response to that question to the kinds of terms that we've used, such as identifying aspects of mode, or perhaps even dimensions of mode using the framework given there. You might think of spoken discourse in terms of the multimodality and the way that a spoken text might use other aspects or other modes of communication, or even the way that other texts, primarily written texts, might use aspects of spoken discourse. You should be able to think about register and about how speakers choose different registers in different contexts. You've also been given an overview of function and how purpose or orientation is a key contextual variable in the way that we interpret language. We considered spontaneity as a way of categorizing the different texts in Paris, but also these other aspects of Hudson's dimensions of mode: ephemerality and permanence, orientation, again linked to function, interactivity, the extent to which there are interactions between the producer and receiver, standardization and formality, including standard English and formal and informal registers, and the extent to which a text is dependent on its context, or to the extent to which it provides its context, or you have to be there to actually get the context from it. Okay, it would be good for you to, or I recommend for learning purposes, for you to write a summary, particularly of the key vocabulary in this unit, so that you have a clear overall understanding of the way that mode is used to categorize spoken texts. In the next session, we are going to look at we continue to look at the context of particularly spoken language in greater detail, and we start to look at the core pragmatic concepts, including dexis, accommodation theory. We will look at politeness and face theory, and we will extend and deepen our understanding of the context of spoken language. Thank you for your focus and attention. Please leave me a comment if you find that this has been useful. If there are any unanswered questions or aspects of language that you'd like me to look at, then you can add a comment, and of course you can give me a like as well, because it would be appreciated. Thank you.